A busted combo land, an infamous legacy combo piece coming to modern in energy form, a card that just might actually be good in Soul Sisters. It's time for more Modern Horizons 3 spoilers. Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for another daily dose of Modern Horizons 3 spoilers. And this set is absolutely absurd. The hits just keep coming, and we have a ton of really powerful, super cool stuff to talk about today, which means we should probably jump right into it, start talking sweet new Magic cards. Before we do, two quick reminders. First, if you need any of these cards, you can snag them from our sponsor Card Kingdom over at cardkingdom.com/MTGGoldfish. Second, to keep up on all the latest spoilers throughout the day, you should head on over to MTGpreviews.com. Anyway, let's talk more Modern Horizons 3. So first up today, we get a new rare land, and it is a good one. Maybe one of the scariest cards from the set so far in Shifting Woodland. So Shifting Woodland, it's a land. It's a green member of the rare land cycle. ETB's tapped unless you control a forest. So going to be tapped on turn 1. As the game goes along, assuming you're a forest heavy deck, got enough fetch lands or whatever, it should always be coming into play untapped. It taps for a green mana, and then it has Delirium. Pay 4 mana, it becomes a copy of target permanent card in your graveyard until end of turn. Activate this only if there are 4 more card types among cards in your graveyard. So obviously, a land that can pay 4 and turn into a copy of any permanent in your graveyard has incredibly high upside. The question's going to be, is this a build around combo piece type land only for specific decks? Or is it a card that you can just jam into any deck that's got a bunch of forests in it and get value out of it? And I think that's a really interesting question. We've seen Delirium be kind of hit or miss in Modern, right? We've seen from like Dragon Rage Channeler that if you want to build around Delirium, you can certainly turn it on very quickly. Dragon Rage Channeler very often turning on, turn 3 or something, turn 2 in some cases. So if your deck is built to turn on Delirium, it's not really a big deal to turn it on, assuming you can dodge graveyard hate, but that's the issue with any graveyard mechanic. On the other hand, a card like Traverse Suvenwald hasn't really been as impactful as a lot of people thought back when it was first previewed, and it shows that it's not a given that you can turn on Delirium. Delirium isn't one of those things that is just going to happen naturally in any deck. So the question is going to be for Shifting Woodland, do you have to build around it like Dragon Rage Channeler, or is this a card that you can just jam into Amulet Titan? Can you jam it into Yawgmoth and just get value out of it? And I think the answer is you're going to have to build around it at least a little bit. Like Yawgmoth, do they even have 4 different card types in their main deck? I'm not sure if they actually do. They got a lot of creatures. I guess there's like Chord as an instant, maybe Eldritch Evolution is a sorcery, and then you got lands. But still, it's kind of a stretch for some decks. Or even like Amulet Titan doesn't really get cards in their graveyard very often. How are you going to end up with all the card types in the graveyard? So you are going to have to build around it a little bit, but I think this card is strong enough, especially being attached to a uncounterable land, that it's going to be worth building around for some decks. So the floor on this card is you turn on Delirium and this becomes a Tarmogoyf until end of turn, and you smash for some damage. It becomes a Young Wolf or a Primeval Titan. You just turn it into whatever happens to be in your graveyard that's the best thing and use it for value. But that's the floor. That's like the worst case scenario for this card. I mean, I guess the literal worst case is you can't turn on Delirium and it's just a land, but it's still a land that's making mana and mostly coming into play on tap. So even the worst case of this card is actually not that bad. The ceiling of this card, though, is ridiculously high as a combo piece. So in Legacy, this is another Dark Depths combo piece. You get Dark Depths in your graveyard. Shifting Woodlands becomes a copy of it. It's not going to have any counters. You just sacrifice it. You get the 2020 Merit Lage. So that's one possibility. I think that Dark Depths probably will be able to take advantage of this card. There's also easy ways to tutor up these combos with Realms Uncharted. Now that we have Echoing Deeps and also Shifting Woodlands, you can create a Realms Uncharted pile that's pretty much going to guarantee you that Dark Depths is going to pop off the next turn with the help of Thespian Stage. So that's something to keep in mind as well, as you got this like easily tutorable instant speed combo. Obviously, the dream is you like get Delirium on and then you like discard an Emrakul, and with its shuffle trigger on the stack, you're like Shifting Woodlands, turn it in Emrakul, annihilate you out of the game. It's going to be hilarious when that actually works. I don't know how realistic that's going to be. I think one of the most exciting parts of this card is it can copy any non-land permanent, and there's some non-land permanents that if you can get them on the battlefield for a single turn, probably win you the game. I'm thinking like Omniscience. Omniscience, when you can just cast all the spells from your hand for free, you're probably going to win the game. Shifting Woodlands works really well with Omniscience. Remember, if you want to turn this into like a Tarmogoyf or something and get value out of it, it's kind of 5 mana because you need 4 mana to activate Shifting Woodlands, and then you're going to need it to be untapped to be able to attack with it or whatever. But if you're copying an Omniscience, it kind of gets a discount because you can tap Shifting Woodlands to pay for its own cost because tapping is not a part of its activation. You get a tapped Omniscience, but whatever, Omniscience doesn't really care if it's tapped. So you get a tapped Omniscience and just combo off and win the game. Or like Bolus's Citadel, a tap Bolus's Citadel, you don't really care, you're still going to get a huge amount of value. And that's what I'm kind of imagining with this card. In some sort of aggressive self-mill deck, it's very possible that by turn 3 even, you can have an Omniscience on the battlefield with the help of Shifting Woodlands. Of course, as I mentioned before, it is soft to Graveyard Hate, and Graveyard Hate is pretty heavily played, but the upside of this is just so incredibly high. So I think this is the card. It'll be built around in combo decks. Really scared of it in like Timeless on Magic Arena, even in Modern. I think it might show up in value, for value in some other decks. We'll have to wait and see just how easy it is to turn on Delirium, but if you can turn on Delirium consistently in your deck, and you got a bunch of green mana, I think it's worth playing a copy or two for value. Plus, you got the legacy combos. There's also some funny shenanigans, and this is like probably the jankiest use of the card, but turning this into stacks pieces, prison pieces, but only during your opponent's turn. Like, you can get a Rule of Law in your graveyard. On your opponent's upkeep, turn Shifting Woodlands into Rule of Law, so your opponent can only cast 1 spell this turn, but then at the end step, it's going to go back into land form. You won't have a Rule of Law during your turn. Or like the Possibility Storm lock. There's some locks with Possibility Storm that essentially just make it so no one can cast spells for the rest of the game. Rule of Law Possibility Storm is actually one of those locks. With this setup, you could like get down the Rule of Law. You can turn Shifting Woodlands into the Possibility Storm during your opponent's upkeep, so your opponent can't cast spells. But then during your upkeep, you're just like, whatever, I'll keep it in land form so I can cast a spell again. So there's some janky lock piece synergies there as well. As far as Commander is concerned, I think this card is worth playing in basically any mono green deck. When it comes to mono color decks in Commander, you have so much room for non-basic lands that I think this makes the cut pretty much every single time. You should have enough forests that it's pretty much always going to be able to come into play untapped, and even if you don't turn it on regularly, it's still an untapped land. It's essentially a forest, so it's still going to be worth it in that case, and when you do turn it on, it's going to be really busted. Once you get to 3 color decks, 2 color decks, that's where it gets a little bit sketchy. You do really want it to come into play untapped. There's a lot of utility land options. You need a bunch of dual lands to make your mana work. In those cases, I think it's a card for specific decks. I don't think I DM this in any 3-color deck or 4-color deck or 5-color deck that I could, but if I'm playing a deck that cares about lands, like Lord Windgrace, or I'm a graveyard deck like Jared that's going to be filling my graveyard and constantly having Delirium, or a self-mill deck like Sidisi, or a Reanimator deck like Old Stick Fingers, then this card is going to be insane. Like, it is going to be one of the strongest lands in your deck. So Shifting Woodlands, the card's kind of wild. This card, I don't think it's like bannably good, hopefully, but I do think this card will see heavy play in Modern. I think it'll see heavy play in Legacy. I think it'll see heavy play in Commander, and all around it's just one of the scariest, strongest cards from the set. We also got a new reprint into Modern in Toxic Deluge. So Toxic Deluge, I'm sure you know this card. It's pretty iconic in Commander, maybe the best Black Wrath. I think it is the best Black Wrath in Commander. 3 mana, you pay any amount of life and give all creatures -X until end of turn. So this is the first time we've seen Toxic Deluge in Modern. The question is, just how good is it going to be in Modern? It has seen fringe Legacy play, but it's definitely not a Legacy staple. But I think this card can actually be pretty strong in Modern. So there's a couple of upsides to Toxic Deluge in 60 card formats. One is it's only 3 mana, so it makes it the cheapest real Wrath available. Of course, because of this cheap cost, you're kind of paying with life rather than mana, which is a very black card thing to do, but still, 3 mana is a really, really good rate for a Wrath. And then, if you just want to kill a bunch of small creatures, clean up the Orcish Bowmasters, the Thalias, the Ragavans, stuff like that, you can do that for 3 mana and 1 life, and you kill all of these things. That's that's a really solid deal. Obviously, it gets a little worse if you gotta kill big creatures, because then you're gonna have to pay a lot of life, which is a problem, but there is some upside there as well. Imagine you're playing a deck like maybe Mono Black Coffers, and your big threats are Sheoldred the Apocalypse, Trolls of Khazad-dûm. You can kind of use Toxic Deluge. It's a one-sided wrath, where you can pay 3 life or 4 life, wipe out all of your opponent's creatures presumably, but still keep your Sheoldred, still keep your Troll. Same with like Yawgmoth, you could wrath the board theoretically, but do it X3, pay 3 life so your Yawgmoth sticks around. So there's some upside there. I think it actually fits in Coffers really well. Not only do you have the chance of keeping your creatures around and turning this into like a 3-mana Plague Win, but Coffers is really good at gaining life. You got Sheoldred, you got March of Wretched Sorrows, so if you're a deck that can replenish your life total, Toxic Deluge gets even better. As I mentioned before, the weakness of this card is it does line up kinda poorly with big creatures. If your opponent has a Primeval Titan or an Archon of Cruelty or an Emrakul the Eon's Torn, you're probably going to be wishing you just had a Damnation, because paying 6 life or 15 life for an Emrakul, probably not going to work. And there will be situations like in the late game where you're like, oh no, I'm almost dead. I really need to Wrath to stabilize. You top deck your Toxic Deluge, and you're like, I just don't have enough life to actually clear out the board. So I think that keeps it from being like a 4 of main deck staple type card. But I certainly think that Toxic Deluge should at least see very heavy sideboard play in Modern as a really nice sweeper for black decks that's easily splashable to fight against aggro decks. And if you're a deck like Coffers or another deck that can replenish your life total, then I think this can be a really nice main deck option as well. Plus, even after getting reprinted a bunch, Toxic Deluge still like $8, $9, $10. And this is a card that I play in every single black commander deck. Like, when I'm looking for a black Wrath, this is the first card I add. And even if I'm playing like a 5-color deck, Toxic Deluge, because it's so easy to splash and so cheap, is usually one of the wraths that makes the cut. So even if it doesn't see a ton of Modern play, and like I said, I think it will see a lot of Modern play, but even if it doesn't, still a solid reprint to get the price down a little bit for Commander. Speaking of Commander reprints, we also got Estrid's Invocation, and this one, I think this is purely a reprint for Commander to get the price down a bit. So this is like a $15-ish card. It's a 3-mana enchantment that says, you may have it enter the battlefield as a copy of an enchantment you control, except it has, at the beginning of your upkeep, you can exile this enchantment, and if you do, return it to the battlefield under its owner's control. So essentially, Estrid's Invocation is like a slight upgrade over Copy Enchantment, probably an upgrade over Mirror Maid. If you're an Enchantress deck, it's an upgrade over Mirror Maid. Essentially, it's a Copy Enchantment, but you can copy something early in the game, and then later in the game, if you got something better to copy, you can blink it on your upkeep, copy that instead. The thing is, Copy Enchantment, Mirror Maid, they just don't really see Modern play, and I don't think the reset blink ability is really going to save it. That's not really the issue with Copy Enchantment. It's just not really worth it, and there's no decks for it. So I think Estrid's Invocation, I would be surprised if this actually saw Modern play. I guess you could jam it in some sort of weird Enchantress deck or something, but my guess is this is mostly just to get the price down a little bit for Commander players. On the other hand, we have a couple of energy cards, which are absolutely ridiculous, and I think definitely going to make the archetype in some form or another playable in Modern. First up, Guide of Souls. So Guide of Souls, 1 mana 1/2. It's a human cleric. It says when another creature enters the battlefield under your control, you gain 1 life and get 1 energy. And then when you attack, you can pay 3 energy. When you do, put 2 counters on a creature and a flying counter, and it becomes an angel in addition to its other type. So Guide of Souls, this is essentially a Soul Sister, a Soul Ward, and a Soul's Attendant. Of course, it does have the downside that it only works with your creatures, so it's kind of formatted like a modern version of those effects, like a Prosperous Innkeeper, mixed with essentially Archangel Elspeth's -2 ability to turn a creature into a big flying threat. So compared to Soul Warden and Soul Attendant, this card has 1 massive upside, and this is something we've talked about throughout spoiler season a little bit, which is it doesn't die to Orcish Bowmasters, and based on the design of Modern Horizons 3, it seems pretty clear that Wizards' plan for Orcish Bowmasters isn't to ban it, even though I think they probably should just ban it, but their plan is just to power creep everything else enough that Bowmasters doesn't kill it. We'll see how that works out in the end. I mean, the issue with that plan, right, is then eventually you need a Orcish Bowmasters that deals 2 damage to deal with all these power crap 1-drops that have 2 toughness, and this cycle of power creep continues. But that is the biggest upside. Like Soul Sisters, the biggest problem with trying to stack up Soul Wardens and Soul Attendants is they get sniped so easily by Bowmasters. Guide of Souls gets around that. So I do think this card is good in Soul Sisters, but that's not why I'm hyped about the card. I'm not going to sell you on it being good in Soul Sisters. Soul Sisters, obviously like tier 3, maybe tier 4, tier 5, somewhere way down the tier list. So I don't think this card suddenly makes Soul Sisters like a tier 1 deck or anything, but I do think because it survives Bowmasters, it is good in Soul Sisters. It's the other homes for this card that make it exciting. One is the Amalia combo deck. So we have seen this deck become very good in Pioneer, and it's seen some fringe play in Modern, but a big problem with it in Modern is its life gain payoffs, its Prosperous Innkeeper, its Soul Wardens. They die to Orcish Bowmaster, so it's really reduced the consistency of the deck, because if you've never seen the combo, you basically need a life gain creature into Amalia, into a Wild Growth Walker, and then you just go infinite. Amalia gets huge, blows up the board, it wins you the game. The problem with the plan, though, was it was so soft to Orcish Bowmasters. I think getting this Soul Warden that doesn't die to Bowmasters definitely does improve Amalia combo quite a bit in Modern. It's also maybe the most exciting part of this card, an absurd energy payoff. So we've seen all these energies cards, Cthulhian Nightmare, Wrathis guys, that look really strong, and one of the things we've said about them is there going to be enough energy production to make them work? Like, are we actually going to have energy decks in Modern? I think Guide of Souls immediately becomes maybe the best energy producer. Yes, you need to be a creature-heavy deck to really make it work, but just having this 1-drop that sits out on the battlefield and doesn't die to Bowmasters and gains you winning energy every time a creature enters the battlefield is exactly what a card like Cthulhian Nightmare needs to actually be able to work in Modern. So I think that's the biggest deal here, is this is a card that could make energy work. It also works ridiculously well with our second big energy card of the day, which is Primal Prayers. Primal Prayers is a busted card. This is one of those energy cards that calls back to an old reserve list card. So Primal Prayers, 4-mana enchantment. It says when it enters the battlefield, you get 2 energy, and then it says you may cast creature spells with mana value 3 or less by paying in energy rather than paying their mana cost. And if you cast a spell this way, you can cast it although it had flash. Important to point out here, I misread this card at first. You don't pay energy equal to the card's mana value. You pay 1 energy no matter what the cost is. So you can cast up to a 3-drop with flash and instant speed for a single energy. So Primal Prayers, it's Aluren. It's energy Aluren. If you don't know Aluren, it is an infamous legacy combo piece. It's exactly the same card, actually, except you don't have any of the energy requirements attached to it. And I think that Primal Prayers is going to be a devastating combo piece in Modern. If you look at Aluren, the main way you combo with Aluren is some sort of loop where you can keep picking up your own creatures. One of the easiest examples is like Cavern Harpy, which is this weird 2-drop that when it enters the battlefield, you can bounce a blue or black creature back to your hand, and then you pay a life to bounce it back to your hand. So you can like use Cavern Harpy to bounce a Icefang Quaddle or Baleful Strix, then you recast the Baleful Strix or Icefang Quaddle for free to draw a card, then you can pick up the Cavern Harpy with its ability, recast it, pick up the Baleful Strix. This will essentially draw you through your entire deck, and then eventually you find a Serac the Archlich. Once you find a Serac, then you just kind of go infinite, right? You're able to cast the Serac, it bounces back, cast it, bounce it back, turbo through all the dungeons, win by going through dungeons an infinite number of times. So this combo in specific doesn't work with Primal Prayers, right? Because you would run out of energy. But there are ways around this. There are modern versions of this. So the easiest is just Primal Prayers, Guide of Souls, in a Serac the Archlich. This lets you go infinite the same way the Legacy deck does. You get down the Guide of Souls, you get down the Primal Prayers, you cast a Serac, it's going to get you an energy with Guide of Souls, you bounce it back to your hand, then you cast it again using the energy, bounce it back to your hand, go through the dungeons an infinite number of times, use the dungeons to win the game. So that's a pretty simple 3-piece combo. There's also more janky versions like White Mane Lion with Guide of Souls. White Mane Lion, just when it enters the battlefield, you can bounce a creature back to your hand, including the White Mane Lion. So if you got Guide of Souls to keep making the energy, toss in a Corpse Knight and you get infinite loss of life for your opponent. Toss in an Essence Warden and you get infinite life gain. Toss in a Storm card as a finisher and you got infinite Storm to win the game. There's also just a straight up 2-card combo with this, with Greenbelt Rampager. So Greenbelt Rampager, this weird 1-drop from Aether Revolt, 1 mana 3/4. When it enters the battlefield, you pay 2 energy. If you can't, you get 1 energy and bounce it back to your hand. So the idea is you play the Primal Prayers. That's going to give you 2 energy. I should say you can't start with any extra extra energy. So keep that in mind. If you have 5 energy or something, this isn't going to work. You need at least Primal Prayers amount of energy or less. So you have the 2 energy from Primal Prayers. You spend 1 energy to Greenbelt Rampager. Greenbelt Rampager going to be like, I can't pay 2 energy, so I get energy, bounce back to your hand, and then you're like, all right, I'll pay another energy, recast the Greenbelt Rampager, I have 1 energy again. Greenbelt Rampager going to be like, still don't have the 2 energy, bounce back to your hand. So you can do this an infinite number of times, which means toss in any of those finishers. Essence Warren for infinite life, Corpse Knight for infinite drain, any Storm finisher for infinite storm, and you just straight up win the game. So Primal Prayers, yes, there's more restrictions than Literal Aluren, but that's a good thing because Literal Aluren is kind of busted, and I do think Primal Prayers will be the engine of an actual combo deck in Modern. So how good it'll be, we'll have to see. It is like 2 to 3 pieces, but the card is absolutely wild, and I think it means we are going to see actual energy combos be a thing in Modern, which is kind of shocking and pretty exciting. Next up, we got a new commander staple that might see some Modern play too in Sowing Mycospawn. So Sowing Mycospawn, 4 mana green, but technically colorless because of Devoid, 3/3 with kicker of 1 and a colorless. It says when you cast this spell, search your library for a land card and put it onto the battlefield and then shuffle. And then when you cast this spell, if you kicked it, exile target land. So you might have noticed reading that card, there's a couple of big words missing, especially from that first ability. Words that are missing include basic in front of land and then tapped in front of battlefield. This tutors for any land for 4 mana and puts it into play untapped, which is absolutely ridiculous. I will play this in literally every commander deck that has green in it from now until the end of time, or I guess at least until Modern Horizons 4 when they probably power creep it somehow. But this card is absolutely absurd. In Commander, this is Solemn Simulacrum, but like a million times better. Of course, it's not colorless, so you do got to be in a green deck, but getting any land is so powerful. Plus, if you can kick it, you can snipe your opponent's best land too. But think about what this is. This is like Solemn mixed with Nature's Lore that can snag your Field of the Dead, or your Ugin's Labyrinth, or your Urza's Tower, or your Cabal Covers, or your Valakut Molten Pinnacle. Name your most busted land. This is gonna get it for 4 mana and leave behind a 3/3 body. So yes, it's not like blinkable like Solemn. I guess that's a downside, but there's so much upside to this card. As far as Modern comparisons, it kind of reminds me of Mavuni Acid Moss, but really it's like Reap and Sow on a creature. It's gonna be interesting to see how impactful this is in 60 card formats. So obviously being able to grab a Tron land or a Cabal Coffers or a Valakut, that's really relevant. Getting non-basic lands is super big in 60 card formats as well. You gotta have the colorless mana if you want to be able to kick it, but I can imagine some pretty explosive draws with this card. I don't know if you remember, a long time ago now, we played this mono green land destruction deck in Modern, and it was such a cool deck. I don't think it really holds up in the current era too well, but I'm curious if we can try it again thanks to Sowing Mycospawn. The idea was basically blow up all your opponent's lands. You could like loop primal commands with Eternal Witnesses and then stake a Trinisphere so your opponent can't really cast anything. Mycospawn seems perfect for this deck. Is another way that can ramp you into your big plays while also getting rid of one of your opponent's lands. Plus, exiling the land is actually a big upside in a world where like Renin 6 is around, the new 6 is around, so just getting rid of the land forever, really, really huge. I think the most obvious home outside of janky land destruction decks is probably some sort of Return of Eldrazi deck. We used to have colorless Eldrazi, we've seen Gruul Eldrazi in the past, and the Eldrazi deck is getting so many new tools that I think maybe this could be a part of it. In the Eldrazi deck, this can be snaking your Eldrazi Temple, your Ugin's Labyrinth, can be snaking Tron lands. You can play Yavimaya Cradle of Growth to make sure you have the green mana to actually cast it, plus you can kick it super easily. So maybe this just fits in with Thought-Knot Seers and Matter Reshapers, ramps you into your big Emeralds or Ulamogs or whatever. So I think that's a pretty interesting home. Plus it could just be a sideboard hate card, especially in a big mana like Primeval Titan style deck. We're able to ramp into this easily. You're able to snipe one of your opponent's best lands and ramp one of your lands on the battlefield. It could even have legacy implications. like, probably the craziest thing you can do with this card is, like, play a normal game of Magic, get a bunch of creatures on the battlefield, then cast this for 4 mana and snake Gaia's Cradle, which is going to come into play untapped, and then you just tap your Cradle and make, like, a huge amount of mana and go on to win the game. This card is ridiculous. So Sowing Mycospawn, we're going to play it in Modern. I can't wait to try some janky land destruction strategies with this card, but I think at its base, this is just like a ridiculous power creep commander card. Wizards went like 30 years of Magic almost, making it really, really rare and hard to tutor up non-basic lands. I mean, remember people playing like expedition maps and just really bad non-basic land tutors, but just in the last year or two, Wizards has kind of pulled out all the stops, and you're like, you know what? We're just gonna let you tutor up all the non-basics you want, and those effects are so powerful. Honestly, I'm feeling pretty vindicated that we banned Field of the Dead and Glacial Chasm on Commander Clash, because cards like this make utility lands in Commander incredibly busted. The card is almost unbelievably good. Like, I'm kind of surprised they actually printed it good. We also got Imskir Iron-Eater, and this card's kind of cool. So it's an 8 mana 5/5. It's a demon. It has affinity for artifacts. It says when it enters the battlefield, you draw X cards and lose X life, where X is half the number of artifacts you control rounded down, and then you can pay 4 mana, sack an artifact. It deals damage equal to the sacked artifact's mana value to any target. So Imskir, it's kind of like a painful thought monitor that's going to draw you way more cards potentially, mixed with an upgraded Bosh Iron Golem with the ability to just sack your artifacts and throw that damage at your opponent's face, at your opponent's creatures, wherever you need it to go. How good is this card going to be in 60 card formats is the question. I think in Commander, if you're like a Bosh player, this is just like way better Bosh, as sad as it is to see Bosh power crept out of Magic. Kind of an iconic character from the past, but Imskir is just like everything Bosh wants to be, but so much more. It's a Bosh that's going to draw you a ton of cards, and it's just really, really good. It has affinity, so instead of being 8 mana, it's often going to be 2 mana. It's Bosh on a whole lot of steroids, which is kind of weird because looking at Bosh, kind of seems like he was already on a lot of steroids, so I don't know what's going on with that. But in 60 card formats, Imskir, I think, has a chance to show up in Affinity deck. So hear me out. In an Affinity deck, you want expensive things because of Solemn Simulacrum, because of Ugin's Labyrinth, which naturally means your deck's going to be playing a lot of Mirror Enforcers, Frogmere Enforcers, Sojourner's Companions, Thought Monitors, which means you're going to have these free, but actually 7 mana value things that you can throw at your opponent with Imskir. Plus, Imskir is going to draw you a ton of cards. Thought Monitor is a staple of Affinity decks, and it draws 2 cards. In a typical Affinity board, by the time you're casting this, because you're playing a bunch of artifact lands, you got Simulacrum Synthesizer popping off, and Springleaf Drums and Frogmites, it's probably drawing you 4 or 5 cards maybe. The only problem I see with this card, and the one reason I'm not going to say, oh, this is like a new Affinity staple, is I am a little bit worried about the loss of life. I know trading cards for life is usually a good deal, but Affinity decks can make so many artifacts that you might actually draw too many cards and lose too much life. But if you can get that mixture right, I imagine this is just like a win the game card essentially in Affinity. And Affinity, because of Springleaf Drums, and if you want to, you can add in like Glimmer Void, Spire of Industry, you can cast this card, even though being a Rakdos card is a little bit weird in a deck that's typically trending towards mono blue. So I think this card has a shot to be like maybe a 1 of an Affinity. Worst case, I feel like this is just a really sweet artifact commander. Like I said before, if you're a Bosh Iron Golem fan, this is like Bosh designed for 2024. It's super power crep Bosh. So if you like the idea of playing a bunch of artifacts and like throwing them at your opponent's face, Imskir just does it so much better, so much cheaper than Bosh, while also drawing you a ton of cards along the way. We also got a new command, Kozilek's command, our first colorless command. So this is double colorless and X for an Eldrazi instant, and it says choose to. Target player creates X 0/1 colorless Eldrazi spawn creature tokens. They insack to make a colorless mana. Target player scries X and draws a card. Exile target creature with mana value X or less, or exile up to X target cards from graveyards. So at first blush, Kozilek's command is powerful, right? It can make a bunch of tokens, it can kind of like pseudo tutor scry through your deck to find what you need, it can be creature removal, it can be graveyard removal, so it does a lot of good things. The problem is, it is really expensive. When you start to dig into the nuts and bolts of this card, think about casting this for 4 mana, Cryptic Command rate, right? You cast this for 4 mana, you're essentially going to get 2 spawns, which is kind of like a brood birthing, I guess. You get a Preordain, essentially a 1 mana card. You can get like a Bad Disembowel for more mana. You can get a Rat's Feast, which is a card I've never seen anyone play. So it just is so much mana to make it good. If you want to be able to kill anything with this card or actually make a huge impact with this card, you're going to need a lot of mana. And I should say, this doesn't mean the card is bad. It just means the card is narrow. This is clearly a card that's designed for Eldrazi style decks, Tron style decks, these big, mostly colorless decks that often struggle with having good removal, because removal, like, typically for colorless isn't that great. So I think this is a card specifically for, like, Eldrazi Ton, for literal Tron. If you're playing Ugin's Labyrinth and Urza's Tower, Eldrazi Temple, which does work with this since it's an Eldrazi instant, that's where this card is going to shine. And in that context, I think it's pretty good because, like I said, colorless decks tend to struggle with removal, and this gives you a not great, but like passable removal option that can also ramp a bunch with spawns, maybe dig through your deck, deal with a graveyard in a pinch, and it does it all at instant speed. So in those style of decks, I think this could serve a purpose, if not in the main deck, then in the sideboard. It's also kind of cute how you can use this for ramp. And again, this would be in some sort of Tron deck or Ugin's Labyrinth, Eldrazi Temple style deck. But what you can do with this card is, on your opponent's end step, dump all your mana into it and maybe kill something or draw a card, but most importantly, make a bunch of Eldrazi spawn tokens, and then each of those spawns is going to be able to sack for a mana the following turn. So then you use all those spawns and dump the rest of your mana into casting an Emrakul or an Ulamog or a Kozilek. So I think that's like the most explosive thing this card can do. The other place I think this card is going to be absolutely great, and honestly, probably what it was designed for, is to be a really good colorless commander card. Colorless commander decks are kind of meh, just because they're lacking some really important things, and one of the biggest really important things that they're lacking is good removal options. And in a Volshadok deck, or a Kozilek deck, or even a Karn Legacy Reforged deck, I think this card's just going to be really good in those decks, just because you don't have a lot of targeted removal options. And one thing colorless decks in Commander are really good at is making a lot of mana. So even though this card is definitely very far from efficient, in a colorless deck that's just dropping a ton of mana rocks, I don't think it really matters. So I think a new staple for colorless commander decks, maybe some implications in Modern, specifically in like Tron decks or Eldrazi big mana style decks, but too expensive, and thanks to double colorless mana, too hard to cast to really show up in non-Eldrazi Tron style decks. We also got the blue member of the rare land cycle in Arch of Innovation. So Arch of Innovation, blue mana, enters the battlefield tapped unless you control an island, and then you can pay a blue and tap it, and the next spell you cast this turn has Improvise. Your artifacts can help you cast it. Each artifact you tap, while activating it, pays for 1 generic mana. So Arch of Innovation, it's kind of like an Inspiring Statuary, except it does work with artifacts, which Inspiring Statuary doesn't. But giving a spell Improvise is a pretty powerful form of ramp, also kind of reminiscent of Urza Lord High Artificer, which just lets you tap all your artifacts to make a mana. Arch of Innovation kind of does the same thing for the cost of 2 mana, because you got to tap it. For the cost of 2 mana, because you have to tap it along with another mana for 1 spell during the turn. If you want to squint really hard, it is kind of like Tolarian Academy at home, like very far at home, like in the basement or like out in the garage or something. But still, you can kind of see how this makes a mana for each artifact you control. There's restrictions. Obviously, you got to spend 2 mana to activate it. You have to be able to tap those artifacts. It only reduces generic mana cost. It's not making blue mana, so you're not going to be able to just cast a blue spell for free. But still, this card does seem like it could do some explosive things. So the most obvious use of this card, I think, is to use it with artifact tokens. I've seen like Lannis decks in Commander, but also in Modern. We played some Lannis Academy manufactured decks where you're able to make an absurd amount of artifact tokens. Having a land like this on the battlefield means that you can be dropping whatever you want, an Emrakul if you want to, very easily. Same with decks that make clues or treasures. I know treasures already tap for mana, but you can tap your treasures to Arc of Innovation to keep them on the battlefield, so you will have them for the next turn. So those are kind of the most obvious homes for the deck. Maybe you could play it in Affinity, although I don't really know what Affinity does with the mana. Like, you can tap all of your Summoning 6 Simulacrum Synthesizer tokens that you just made to cast, I don't know, a Frogmite an Emrakul is, I guess, the dream scenario. I don't know how realistic that is. So I think this is a card that's really powerful and has a lot of potential. I'm just not seeing like a super ready built home for it in Modern. But let me know what you think about this one, because I think this card, the upside is high enough that I think it can be very, very good. Maybe it's just like a build around, but I think it has potential to be very strong. Where I do know it fits is in basically any artifact commander deck. Like if you're playing Mishra or Urza or Brea or Urza, anything like that, why wouldn't you play this card? It's going to come into play untapped. If it does nothing, that's fine. It's still making mana. And then sometimes it's going to let you have a really, really big, huge turn by tapping all your random artifacts to cast some massive thing to win the game. So Arc of Innovation, the card seems sweet. Like I said, I'm not sure exactly where it fits in Modern, but I wouldn't be surprised if it had a home, because if you squint hard enough, it is kind of like a very watered down Tolarian Academy, and Tolarian Academy, one of the most busted land wizards has ever made. We also got a new Ashling, an Ashling Flame Dancer, and this card is kind of wild. So 4 mana 4/4, it's a mythic legendary elemental shaman. It says you don't lose unspent red mana, it steps in phase's end, and it has Magecraft. Whenever you cast or copy an instant or sorcery, discard a card, then draw a card. So you're going to do that every single time. And then if it's the second time this ability is resolved, it deals 2 damage to each opponent and each creature they control. And if it's the third time it resolved this turn, add 4 mana to your mana pool. So Ashling, it kind of reminds me of 2 Omnaths stapled together, but with a spell slinger theme. So it has the mana storing ability of Omnath Locust of Mana, but for red mana rather than green mana, and that's kind of exciting, right? Omnath is still a pretty popular card, even though it came out like 15 years ago, especially in Commander, and then it has a little bit of Omnath Locust of Creation. Omnath Locust of Creation, I think, is mostly better because its ability is a landfall ability rather than a spellcraft ability, but still, if you can cast a few spells, you kind of get the same thing you get out of Omnath, right? Where you're going to loot first every time. That's not like Omnath, but then eventually you're going to damage your opponent and their creatures and eventually make 4 mana, and then that mana, if you can't spend it, is going to store up for the future as long as Ashling sticks around. So as far as Modern is concerned, I don't think this card is going to make it. I honestly don't think this card was designed to make it in Modern. If you look at the abilities, essentially, every time you cast or copy a spell, you get to Rummage, discard and draw, which is a pretty powerful ability. It lets you fill your graveyard for any flashback effects or graveyard synergies or Underworld Breach style stuff. Plus, it just lets you dig to find what you need. And then, if you cast 2 spells, you get a Pyroclasm that only hits your opponent's stuff and hits their face. And then the last mode gives you that Omnath Burst of Mana. The problem I see with this card in Modern is it's kind of like Urabrask or something, right? Urabrask is a really powerful 4-drop in a deck that's going to cast a bunch of spells, dealing damage and pinging your opponent and making mana and eventually flipping into this ridiculous saga. The problem is Modern Spellslinger style decks don't want to be playing 4-drops. You want to be winning by turn 4. If you look at like a Modern Prowess deck, it's going to be like Dragon Rage Sailor, Monastery Swiftspear, Slickshot Show Off, cast a bunch of spells, bolt your face, hopefully kill you on turn 3. It doesn't want to play a 4-drop that doesn't do anything until you untap with it the next turn and try to cast some spells. So I honestly think this card, even though it's got a ton of text and powerful text and kind of compares to Omnath, I don't think this card really has a chance to see Modern play. Omnath is just so much better in Modern because the ETB draws. So worst case it dies, you already got your card back. And then if you wait, you can theoretically play and crack a fetch land in the same turn or save up your fetch land so you can trigger it right away. When you're going to need with Ashling much more setup to be able to cast 3 spells in a turn compared to like cracking a fetch land with Omnath. So I don't think this is a Modern card. I would be surprised if it was anything more than a Sweet Against the Odds episode. Where this card will shine though is in Commander. So this is a card that you can play in pretty much any Spellslinger deck and get value out of it, because if you're playing Viran or Mizzix or Niv Mizzet Perun or whatever, you're going to be casting a lot of spells, and Ashling is just going to be fine. It's going to be looting through your deck, it's going to be wiping away your opponent's board, it's going to be damaging them, it's going to be making mana, so it's going to be fine in any Spellslinger deck. And I honestly think this might be the new best mono red Spellslinger commander. If you look at mono red Spellslinger, Number 1 is Urabrosk, and Urabrosk is really sweet, and I think people will keep playing it. And then number 2 is Burgi. I guess Zada's in there somewhere, but Zada's like kind of its own thing. It's not a traditional Spellslinger deck, but those are like the most popular Spellslinger commanders. I think if I was going to build Mono Red Spellslinger, I'm pretty sure I'd just go with Ashling. The ability to loot through your deck is so powerful, plus its mana production can be so strong, and the mana storage ability can allow for these huge combo storm turns. I think this is just better Urabrosk if you want to play Mono Red Spellslinger. You might have noticed that Braid of Fire has been spiking the last couple of weeks. Well, now we officially know why. This was one of the cards that leaked a couple of weeks ago, and people immediately realized that Braid of Fire pretty good if you can store up its mana from turn to turn. The problem with Braid of Fire, which is this wonky enchantment that has cumulative upkeep of add a red mana, the problem is that mana is added during your upkeep, so it's really hard to use that mana. So it normally makes a bunch of mana and it just goes to waste, but with Ashling, it becomes real mana essentially, because it can store up and then you can spend that mana during your main phase, which is kind of ridiculous. So this is why Braid of Fire has been spiking. It's also cute with like Basilisk Collar. If you can give it Death Touch, the ability to trigger it the second time and deal 2 damage to each opponent and all their things turns this into essentially a repeatable one-sided board wipe that'll also gain you a bunch of life thanks to the lifelink on Basilisk Collar. So Ashling Flame Dancer, really cool card, really powerful card. I expected to see a ton of commander play, but as a 4-drop Spellslinger card, it's just too expensive for Modern. As far as lower rarity reprints, wanted to shout out Reform just because it's got dropped down to uncommon for the first time. Reform, not an especially competitive card, but it is a neat card. It's a 4-mana 0/1 that when it dies, you make a 3/3 fish, that when it dies, you make a 6/6 whale, that when it dies, you make a 9/9 kraken. So it's a cool card for like sacrifice decks, for sea creature decks, and being uncommon, gonna be kind of neat for limited. Finally today, we got a huge pile of commons and uncommons, which you can check them all out over on MTGPreviews.com. Some of them are kind of neat. Some of the uncommon Eldrazi seem like they could be pretty powerful, at least in limited, if not in constructed. A bunch of new bestow stuff, some energy stuff, some adapt stuff. So definitely check it out over at MTGPreviews.com. Anyway, that brings us to the end of our daily Modern Horizons 3 spoilers for today. So let me know what you think about all these sweet new cards in the comments. What's your favorite one of the day? Let me know. Thanks for watching, everyone. I hope you enjoyed it. And I'll be back tomorrow with even more Modern Horizons 3 spoilers. So until then, have a spectacular day, and I will talk to you soon. Looking for even more magic? Well, you can check out yesterday's spoiler video here, or maybe the Against the Odds, where we saw just how many ancient cornucopias we could make in Standard.